The unexpected encounter. The warm glow of the Lisbon sunset bathed the city in hues of gold and crimson as Cristiano Ronaldo stepped into a small, family-owned cafe tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. It wasn't one of the luxurious places he was accustomed to visiting. There were no flashing cameras, no autograph seekers, and no suffocating media frenzy. Just a peaceful haven where locals gathered to share stories over steaming cups of coffee. The cafe, Coração Alegre, Happy Heart, had been around for decades, passed down through generations. It wasn't fancy, but it had a charm that spoke to Ronaldo. The rustic wooden chairs, faded photographs of past patrons on the walls, and the scent of freshly baked pastries reminded him of his childhood. He had returned to Lisbon for a short visit before his next match, seeking solitude away from the relentless media attention. This little cafe was an escape from the limelight. As he entered, heads turned, but no one rushed toward him. The people here weren't oblivious to who he was. They simply respected his space. A few nods and murmured greetings were exchanged, and Ronaldo responded with a small smile before settling into a corner table. The waitress on duty that evening, Isabela, was having a rough day. Her face was tight with frustration, her ponytail slightly disheveled from hours of work, and her patience was wearing thin. She wasn't usually like this. Her colleagues knew her as kind and hardworking, but today had been particularly challenging. A few minutes earlier, a rude customer had insulted her, another had complained about their meal, and to top it all off, her manager had scolded her for being slow. She was at her breaking point. When she saw Cristiano Ronaldo sitting at the table, her heart skipped a beat, not out of admiration, but out of exhaustion. Another rich celebrity, expecting royal treatment, another demanding customer. She had nothing against Ronaldo personally, but she had served enough wealthy tourists to know how they behaved. With a deep breath, she walked over, gripping her notepad. "Good evening. What would you like?" she asked, her voice neutral, trying to mask her irritation. Ronaldo looked up, sensing her tone. He wasn't offended. He had met countless people like this before, people who had been hardened by life, who had their own battles to fight. He gave her a polite smile. "I'll have an espresso and a pastel de nata, please." She scribbled it down quickly, not meeting his eyes. "Anything else?" "No, that's all. Thank you." She turned and walked away without another word. Ronaldo watched her go, a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. There was a story behind her attitude, and he could sense it. A few minutes later, Isabela returned with his order, setting it down a bit too forcefully. The espresso cup clinked against the saucer. "Enjoy," she muttered and walked away before he could thank her. As Ronaldo took a sip of his espresso, he overheard a conversation from the kitchen. "Isabela, what's with your attitude today? You just slammed Ronaldo's coffee down like he was your worst enemy." "I don't care who he is," she snapped back. "They're all the same. Rich, entitled, expecting us to bow down to them." There was a pause. Then another voice, softer, perhaps a coworker trying to reason with her. "You don't know that. Maybe he's different." Ronaldo sat back in his chair, amused but also intrigued. He had encountered skepticism before, but something about Isabela's words told him she had personal reasons for her resentment. Moments later, a commotion erupted near the counter. A man, visibly drunk, was arguing with the cashier. His voice rose, and the cafe grew tense. "I paid for this. You're trying to cheat me," the man slurred. "Sir, you haven't paid yet," the cashier said calmly. "Liar." The man suddenly reached for the cup of water on the counter and, in his anger, knocked it over, right onto Isabela. A gasp swept through the cafe as the cold water drenched her uniform. She stood there, frozen, fists clenched. The cafe owner rushed over. "Isabela, go clean up. I'll handle this." But before she could move, Ronaldo did something no one expected. He stood up, walked toward the scene, and without saying a word, took off his expensive designer jacket and placed it over Isabela's shoulders. Everyone stared. Isabela looked up, her frustration momentarily replaced by surprise. Ronaldo smiled gently. "It's just water. Don't let it ruin your evening." She opened her mouth to reply, but no words came out. And in that moment, something changed. This was just the beginning. A storm behind her eyes. Isabela stood frozen, Cristiano Ronaldo's expensive designer jacket draped over her shoulders. The warmth of the fabric contrasted sharply with the cold water that had just been splashed on her uniform. She could feel every pair of eyes in the cafe locked on her, waiting for her reaction. The air in the cafe was thick with tension. The drunk man who had knocked over the water had been escorted out, grumbling to himself. But the chaos he had left behind was still very much present, lingering like a shadow over the small space. Isabela's hands clenched into fists at her sides. She didn't need saving. She didn't need sympathy. And she certainly didn't need a millionaire footballer's pity. With a deep breath, she lifted her chin, grabbed the edge of Ronaldo's jacket, and carefully folded it. Without a word, she extended it back toward him. "Thank you. But I don't need this," she said, her voice even but firm. Ronaldo hesitated. He wasn't used to this kind of reaction. Usually, when he did something kind, people either gushed with gratitude or were too stunned to speak. But this woman, this fiery waitress with eyes full of storms, was different. He could have just taken the jacket and let it go. He could have walked back to his table, finished his espresso, and left the cafe like nothing had happened. But something about her made him pause. He saw himself in her, not in the sense of fame, fortune, or talent, but in the way she carried herself. The quiet defiance in her eyes, the way she stood her ground as if she had fought 1,000 battles before and refused to let this one break her. So instead of taking the jacket back, he did something unexpected. He pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. "Let me buy you a coffee," he said casually, as if he weren't one of the most famous athletes in the world, as if this were the most normal request in the world. Isabela blinked. "What? You've had a rough day," he said, gesturing to the empty chair in front of him. "Sit down. Have a coffee. Let's talk." She stared at him as if he had just spoken in a foreign language. "You want me to sit and have coffee? With you? Why not?" A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "Because you're Cristiano Ronaldo." And he tilted his head, a small, amused smile playing on his lips. "Does that mean I can't have a conversation with someone who looks like they need one?" Isabela narrowed her eyes, searching his face for insincerity, for any hint of mockery. But she found none. Just patience, genuine curiosity. For a moment, she considered saying no. She didn't want to be another one of those people in his life. Those who fawned over him, who acted differently just because he was famous. But then she surprised herself. She sighed, pulled out the chair, and sat down. "Fine," she muttered. "One coffee." Ronaldo smiled as if he had just won a match. "Good choice. A cup of honesty." A few minutes later, a steaming cup of coffee was placed in front of her. Isabela wrapped her hands around it, welcoming the warmth. She had no idea why she was sitting here, why she had agreed to this. Maybe she was just too tired to fight it. Maybe, deep down, she needed this more than she wanted to admit. Ronaldo took a sip of his own coffee before speaking. "So," he said, leaning forward slightly, "tell me something about yourself." Isabela raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" "Anything. Who is Isabela when she's not working in a cafe?" She let out a scoff. "That's assuming there is an Isabela outside of this job." "Come on," he said, tilting his head. "Everyone has a story." She hesitated. Then, with a sigh, she finally spoke. "I used to dream of being a dancer," she admitted, her voice quieter now. "When I was younger, I wanted to perform on the biggest stages. Ballet, contemporary, even flamenco. I lived for it." Ronaldo listened intently, nodding for her to continue. But life had other plans. She glanced down at her coffee, swirling it slowly. My parents weren't exactly supportive. They thought dancing was a waste of time, something that wouldn't pay the bills. When I turned 16, my father got sick. I had to drop everything to help support the family. School, dance, everything took a backseat. Ronaldo's expression softened. He knew what it was like to sacrifice, to fight for a dream when the odds were stacked against you. "So you stopped dancing?" he asked. Isabela nodded. "I had no choice. I started working, trying to keep food on the table. One job turned into another, then another. And now, here I am, serving coffee instead of chasing a dream." A bitter chuckle escaped her lips. "Funny how life works, huh?" Ronaldo didn't respond right away. He simply observed her, reading between the lines. "Do you miss it?" he finally asked. "Every day." "Then why don't you go back to it?" Isabela looked up, her eyes flashing with something unreadable. "It's not that simple," she said. "Dreams don't pay rent. They don't put food on the table. I don't have the luxury of chasing something that may never happen." Ronaldo leaned back, considering her words. "I understand," he said. "More than you might think." Isabela scoffed. "You? What could you possibly understand about struggling? You're literally one of the richest and most successful athletes in the world." Ronaldo chuckled. "And how do you think I got here?" Isabela opened her mouth, then closed it. "I was just a boy from Madeira," he continued. "I grew up in a small house with barely anything. My family struggled. I remember nights when we didn't have enough food. My father worked as a kit man at a local club, and my mother cleaned houses. I knew from a young age that if I wanted to change my life, I had to give everything to football." He tapped his fingers against the table. "There were times I wanted to quit, times when it felt impossible. But I kept pushing, kept working, because I knew the alternative was staying stuck in a life I didn't want." Isabela listened in silence. "I get it," he said gently. "You feel trapped. You've been fighting for so long that you don't even know what it's like to dream anymore. But that doesn't mean it's over." She swallowed hard, his words hitting her in a place she didn't expect. "I don't know if I have it in me anymore," she admitted. Ronaldo smiled. "You do. You just forgot." Silence stretched between them. Then softly he added, "I think it's time you remember." For the first time that evening, Isabela felt something shift inside her. Something she hadn't felt in a long, long time. Hope. The weight of the past. Isabela sat across from Cristiano Ronaldo, her fingers gripping the warm ceramic mug, yet she felt cold inside. His words lingered in her mind, echoing in places she hadn't allowed herself to visit in years. "I think it's time you remember." For a moment, she let herself imagine it, standing on a stage, lights illuminating her silhouette, the music coursing through her veins like electricity. The thought was intoxicating, but reality was a relentless storm that refused to let her dream for too long. She scoffed, shaking her head. "It's easy for you to say, Ronaldo. You had talent. People believed in you." His gaze darkened, his fingers tracing the rim of his espresso cup. "You think everyone believed in me." His voice was quiet, but there was a weight to it. "When I was 12, I left my family to move to Lisbon for football. I cried myself to sleep most nights. People mocked my accent, called me crybaby and toothpick because I was skinny. Coaches doubted me. But I worked harder. I had to." She exhaled, leaning back in her chair. "And look where you are now. A global icon. A millionaire." His lips twitched in amusement. "That didn't happen overnight. And it definitely didn't happen because life made it easy." He leaned forward slightly. "But this isn't about me. It's about you. You're acting like the decision has already been made, like your story is over." Isabela looked away. "Maybe it is." Ronaldo tilted his head, watching her. "What happened?" She stiffened. "What do you mean?" "You weren't always like this," he said. "People don't just stop believing in their dreams without a reason. Something happened." For a long moment, she stayed silent. Then, with a heavy sigh, she spoke. A broken promise. I had one chance, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. A real chance. Ronaldo said nothing, just nodded for her to continue. I was 18 when a famous dance academy in Spain accepted me. It was my dream come true. A small, sad smile flickered across her lips. For the first time, it felt like the universe was finally on my side. Ronaldo could hear the ache in her voice, the kind of pain only someone who had tasted their dream and lost it could understand. My father was sick by then, she continued. Cancer. It had been getting worse, but he never let me see how bad it really was. He always told me to follow my dreams. She swallowed hard. He promised me he'd be okay. Ronaldo already knew where this was going, but he let her say it. I left for Spain. She let out a shaky breath. For 6 months, I trained harder than I ever had. I was exhausted, sore, struggling financially, but I didn't care. I was finally where I belonged. She paused, her fingers tightening around the coffee mug. Then one night, I got the call. Her voice cracked, and she looked away. My father had passed away. Ronaldo exhaled slowly. I wasn't there, she whispered. I wasn't there to hold his hand, to say goodbye. He had spent his whole life working so I could have a future, and I wasn't even there when he needed me most. The cafe was silent except for the faint hum of conversation in the background. I came back home for the funeral, she continued, her tone flat. And I never went back. Ronaldo frowned. Why not? She gave a hollow laugh. Because my mother fell apart. She couldn't handle it. Bills started piling up. The house was too quiet without him. She couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. She needed me. And just like that, my dream wasn't important anymore. She forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. So that's the story, Ronaldo. That's why I stopped. He studied her for a long moment before speaking. That's why you paused. She blinked. What? You didn't stop, he said, voice steady. You paused. Life threw something at you that no one should have to go through. You did what you had to do, but that doesn't mean it's over. She let out a bitter laugh. I haven't danced in years. I wouldn't even know where to start. Ronaldo shrugged. By starting. She shook her head. You don't get it. I'm not young anymore. I don't have money. I don't have connections. You don't have excuses either, he interrupted gently. Her jaw tightened. You think I had money when I started, he continued. I had nothing. No guarantees, just work ethic and belief. That's all you need. Isabela looked away. It's not that simple. No, he agreed, but nothing worth having ever is. The first step. The cafe had begun to clear out as the night deepened. Ronaldo finished his espresso and set the cup down, pushing back his chair. Let me show you something. She frowned. Show me what? He stood up and held out a hand. Come on. Isabela hesitated, glancing around. I have work. I'll talk to your boss, he said easily. You've worked hard enough today. She hesitated again, her instincts screaming at her to say no. But something inside her, a small, fragile thing that had long been buried, whispered, what if? And for the first time in years, she listened to that voice. With a deep breath, she reached out and took his hand. The moment their fingers touched, something shifted. Not between them. This wasn't about romance or celebrity or any of the ridiculous things that might make headlines. This was about something deeper, a second chance. A chance to fight for something she had long convinced herself was lost. And as she followed him out of the cafe, into the cool Lisbon night, she had no idea that this moment, the decision to take his hand, would change her life forever. Rediscovering the fire. The streets of Lisbon were quieter at night, bathed in the soft glow of streetlights, the air crisp with a hint of salt from the nearby sea. Isabela walked beside Cristiano Ronaldo, her steps uncertain, her mind filled with questions. She wasn't sure why she had agreed to this. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was curiosity. Or maybe, just maybe, she was tired of running from herself. "Where are we going?" she asked, crossing her arms against the night's cool breeze. Ronaldo glanced at her with a small smile. "You'll see." They walked in silence for a few blocks until they reached an old building with tall, arched windows. The sign above the entrance was faded, the paint peeling, but the words were still legible. Casa de Danza, House of Dance. Isabela stopped in her tracks, her heart slamming against her ribs. "No," she said immediately, taking the step back. "Absolutely not." Ronaldo raised an eyebrow. "Why not?" "I haven't danced in years," she argued. "This is ridiculous." He shrugged. "So, that doesn't mean you forgot how." Isabela clenched her fists. "You don't get it. Dance isn't just about moving your body. It's about rhythm, control, emotion. Things I've lost." Ronaldo studied her for a moment. "You lost them, or you buried them." She swallowed, her throat dry. Without another word, he pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The scent of polished wood and faint traces of perfume drifted out. Isabela stood frozen at the entrance, torn between the life she had built and the one she had left behind. Then she heard it. Music, a soft, haunting melody drifting through the space, like a whisper from her past. She closed her eyes. For years, she had silenced that part of herself. She had drowned it in the noise of responsibility, in the weight of grief, in the endless monotony of survival. But here, now in this place, it stirred. She exhaled slowly and stepped inside. The mirror's reflection. The dance studio was empty except for them. Tall mirrors lined one wall, reflecting their figures under the dim lighting. The hardwood floor was smooth, well worn from years of movement. Cristiano walked over to a small speaker in the corner and pressed a button. The music swelled, a slow, elegant violin piece that sent shivers down her spine. He turned to her. "Dance." Isabela let out a dry laugh. "Excuse me." "Dance," he repeated. "Show me." She shook her head. "I told you, I can't." "Not can't," he interrupted. "Won't." She inhaled sharply. "Why do you care so much?" "Because I see it in your eyes." His voice was calm but firm. "You're carrying something too heavy, and you've convinced yourself that you can't put it down. But you can. And I think this," he gestured around the room, "is the way you do it." She looked away, the walls closing in. She wanted to run. She wanted to fight. But most of all, she wanted to dance. Her fingers twitched at her sides. Her body remembered, even if her mind resisted. She closed her eyes, listening to the music. And then, without thinking, without overanalyzing, without fear, she took a step forward. Awakening. The moment her foot touched the floor, something clicked. Her arms lifted in a slow, graceful motion. Her body curved, following the melody, instinct taking over where doubt had once lived. For the first time in years, she let herself feel. She wasn't performing. She wasn't proving anything. She was simply existing in movement, allowing the rhythm to guide her, allowing the pain to dissolve into each step, each turn, each controlled breath. Ronaldo watched in silence, his expression unreadable. He had seen incredible athletes. He had witnessed some of the greatest moments in sports history. But this was different. This wasn't competition. This was raw, unfiltered passion. Isabela's movements were fluid, effortless, yet filled with emotion. She danced like someone who had lost everything, and was just now realizing she could still fight for it. Minutes passed, but she didn't notice. She was lost in it. And then, she stopped. Her chest heaved, her body trembling, but not from exhaustion. She turned to Ronaldo, eyes wide, disoriented. She didn't know what to say. He smiled. "You remember now." Tears burned at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them away. She didn't know if she was angry at him for pushing her, or grateful. Maybe both. The fear of beginning again. Silence settled between them. Then, Ronaldo crossed his arms. So what happens now? Isabela ran a shaky hand through her hair. What do you mean? You danced, he said simply. And you're still standing. So what's stopping you from doing it again? She exhaled, shaking her head. It's not that easy. I didn't say it was. He took a step closer. I'm saying it's possible. She hesitated. All her life, she had been told what she couldn't do, what she shouldn't chase, what was unrealistic. And yet, in the span of one night, Cristiano Ronaldo had managed to strip away years of self-doubt and fear, leaving her with only one thing: a choice. She could walk away and return to her old life, or she could take the first step toward reclaiming what was hers. Her heart pounded. She knew what she wanted. But was she brave enough to go after it? As if sensing her hesitation, Ronaldo smirked. Let me guess. You're going to say something about how it's impossible, how it's too late, how you don't have the resources or time. Isabela crossed her arms. Well, yeah. He chuckled. Good thing I know a thing or two about making the impossible happen. She frowned. What are you saying? He leaned against the wall, arms folded. I'm saying I can help. She blinked. Help how? I know people, he said casually. People who can train you, give you opportunities. I can get you into a program. But, he held up a finger. It only works if you want it. Her throat tightened. The fire and the fear. The decision had been made. Or at least Isabela had said yes. But as she walked back home that night, the city lights casting long shadows on the pavement, doubt clawed at her. Cristiano Ronaldo, the Cristiano Ronaldo, had just offered to help her reignite a dream she had long since buried. It should have felt exhilarating, like a once-in-a-lifetime chance. Instead, it felt terrifying. The quiet hum of Lisbon's late-night streets surrounded her, but her mind was louder. What if I fail? What if I'm not good enough anymore? What if this is just another cruel joke life is playing on me? She had barely stepped into her tiny apartment when her phone buzzed. A message. Cristiano, be at the training center tomorrow at 7 a.m. Don't be late. She stared at the screen. No hesitation, no second guessing. Just a command, as if her future was already set in stone. She sighed, tossing her phone onto the couch. What have I gotten myself into? The first morning of the rest of her life. The next morning, Isabela stood outside a sleek, modern training facility in the heart of Lisbon, staring at the glass doors as if they might swallow her whole. This was insane. Cristiano Ronaldo, one of the most famous athletes in the world, was offering to help her reignite a dream she had buried years ago. Could she do it? Could she risk it all again? Her pulse roared in her ears. And then, she nodded. A small, hesitant nod. But it was enough. Ronaldo grinned. Good. For the first time in years, Isabela felt something she had long forgotten. Hope. Her heart pounded. She had barely slept. Every muscle in her body screamed at her to turn around, to walk away, to return to the safety of the life she knew, even if it wasn't the life she wanted. Then she heard a familiar voice behind her. You're overthinking again. She turned. Cristiano Ronaldo stood there, dressed in his usual athletic gear, looking every bit the world-class athlete he was. She swallowed. No excuses, he said, opening the door. Let's go. Before she could protest, he walked inside, and her feet betrayed her by following. The inside of the facility was state-of-the-art, polished floors, mirrored walls, and the faint smell of sweat and determination. Isabela felt small, insignificant. Then she saw her. A woman stood near the center of the training floor, stretching with the kind of effortless grace that made Isabela's stomach twist. She was tall, elegant, and exuded an air of confidence. Cristiano walked over to her. This is Sofia Marques, he said, one of the best contemporary dance coaches in Portugal. Isabela's stomach dropped. An actual professional. Sophia turned, studying Isabela with sharp eyes. So this is the one you've been talking about. Cristiano nodded. She has talent. She just forgot. Sophia crossed her arms. And you think she can just pick up where she left off? Isabela opened her mouth to defend herself, but Cristiano spoke first. I think she can do more than that. Sophia's gaze lingered on Isabela for a moment longer before she turned and gestured toward the training floor. Let's see if you can prove him right. The first steps backward. It started badly. No, worse than badly. It started terribly. The moment Isabela attempted her first basic movements, she felt it. Years of stiffness, hesitation, and self-doubt crashing into her all at once. Her body didn't move the way it used to. Her balance was off. Her turns were sloppy. Every mistake felt like a slap to the face. She stumbled on a simple pirouette, her foot slipping slightly. Sophia sighed. You're overthinking. Isabela gritted her teeth. I'm trying. That's the problem. Sophia said. You're trying instead of feeling. Isabela wanted to snap back to argue, but she knew Sophia was right. Cristiano watched from the side, arms crossed. He said nothing, but she could feel his presence, the weight of expectation. She took a deep breath, shaking out her hands. You can do this. She tried again. Better. Not great, but better. Sophia watched, nodding slightly. Okay. There's something there, but you need work. A lot of work. Isabela wiped sweat from her forehead. I know. Sophia smirked. Then let's begin. The breaking point. Days passed. Then a week. Training became brutal. Sophia pushed her harder than she had ever been pushed before. The drills were relentless. The corrections were harsh. Her muscles ached. Her body screamed. Her mind doubted. Cristiano checked in often, but he never coddled her. He simply watched, offering occasional words of advice, sometimes just a simple nod when she did something right. But deep down, Isabela wondered if she had made a mistake. Maybe she wasn't meant for this anymore. Maybe she was wasting everyone's time. And then, she hit the wall. The moment everything almost fell apart. It happened during an intense practice session. Sophia had been pushing her hard, correcting every little mistake. You're holding back, Sophia snapped. I'm trying. You're not trying. You're afraid. Sophia interrupted. You're afraid of failing. Afraid of getting it wrong. And that fear is killing you more than any mistake ever will. Something inside Isabela snapped. She stopped mid-step, breath ragged. Her hands clenched into fists. I can't, she whispered. I just can't. The room went silent. Sophia exhaled, rubbing her temples. You can. You just won't let yourself. Isabela turned away. Maybe this was a mistake. And just like that, she walked off the training floor, the talk she didn't want but needed. She stormed outside, breathing heavily, frustration clawing at her. A few seconds later, she heard footsteps behind her. You're not really going to quit, are you? Cristiano's voice was calm, but there was something sharp underneath it. She didn't turn around. I'm not good enough anymore. He stepped closer. You were never going to be perfect on the first try. She let out a dry laugh. I thought you didn't believe in failure. He smirked. I don't, but I believe in fighting through failure. Silence. Then, softer. I know what it's like, he said. To doubt. To struggle. To question if you still have it in you. She turned to face him. And what do you do when that happens? His eyes held steady. I remind myself why I started. Her breath caught in her throat. Why did you start, Isabela? He asked. The moment Isabela stepped back into the dance studio, something felt different. It wasn't the space. Casa de Danza was the same as it had been a few minutes ago. The polished wooden floors, the mirrored walls reflecting her every doubt, and the faint hum of music playing in the background. It wasn't the people. Sophia still stood in the center, arms crossed, her eyes sharp and analytical. Cristiano was near the entrance, watching silently, his presence both grounding and daunting. No, the change wasn't in the room. It was inside her. She wasn't here to impress anyone. She wasn't here to prove a point. She was here for one reason: to take back what she had lost. Sophia arched an eyebrow as Isabela walked back onto the training floor, her expression unreadable. Done sulking. Isabela took a deep breath and nodded. Let's try again. A flicker of approval crossed Sophia's face, but she didn't soften. Good. Then stop overthinking and dance. The music started. The first few steps were shaky, her body still tangled with hesitation. But then something shifted. She let go. She stopped analyzing, stopped fearing, stopped thinking. Her movements became fluid, natural, instinctual. The music wasn't just sound. It was part of her, guiding her limbs, pulling her forward. Every turn, every leap, every breath carried the weight of years of suppressed longing. Sophia watched with careful eyes, nodding slightly. Cristiano leaned against the wall, arms crossed, a small smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. By the time the song ended, Isabela was breathless, and for the first time in forever, she felt alive. The hardest climb begins. That moment wasn't the end, it was the beginning. The days that followed were brutal. Sophia wasn't just a coach, she was a relentless force of nature. Every mistake was called out, every weakness exposed. If Isabela's posture was off by an inch, Sophia corrected it. If her foot placement was sloppy, she made her repeat the move 100 times. The old Isabela, the one who had accepted mediocrity, who had convinced herself she wasn't good enough, would have quit. But she wasn't that person anymore. She couldn't be. Cristiano checked in every day, sometimes watching from the sidelines, sometimes offering words of encouragement in his straightforward way. Push harder, he'd say. You're close. Or simply, do it again. There were days when Isabela wanted to scream. Days when her muscles burned so badly, she collapsed on the floor after practice. Days when doubt tried to creep back in. But she refused to let it win. Every time she fell, she got up. Every time she wanted to quit, she reminded herself why she had started. She was no longer fighting to reclaim her past. She was fighting for her future. The unexpected setback. Just when things were finally falling into place, life threw her another test. It happened during an intense session, one of the hardest routines Sophia had ever given her. It was a mix of contemporary and flamenco, a piece that required precision, strength, and emotional vulnerability. Isabela pushed herself harder than ever, her body moving in perfect sync with the music. But as she launched into a turn, she felt it, a sharp, searing pain shooting up her ankle. She gasped, stumbling. The room spun as she clutched her foot. Sophia was at her side in seconds. What happened? Isabela winced, trying to put weight on it, but the pain was instant and unforgiving. Cristiano, who had been watching from the corner, was already moving toward her. His expression was unreadable, but his concern was evident. You need to sit down, he said firmly. I can still dance, she insisted, trying again. This time, the pain nearly brought her to her knees. Cristiano shot Sophia a look. Call the physio. She swallowed hard. 1,000 memories flooded her mind. Her father's voice, her childhood dreams, the stage lights, the rush of adrenaline. She closed her eyes. And then she whispered the truth. Because it made me feel alive. Cristiano nodded. Then stop letting fear take that away from you. Her heart pounded. She knew what she had to do. Without another word, she turned and walked back inside. And this time, she didn't look back. The breaking point and the breakthrough. A test of willpower. The next few days were torture, not because of the pain, but because of the waiting. The physio confirmed it wasn't a major injury, but it was enough to sideline her for at least a week. A week felt like an eternity. Every second she wasn't training felt like she was falling behind, like the dream was slipping through her fingers again. She sat in the empty studio one evening, staring at her reflection in the mirror. What if this was a sign? What if she wasn't meant for this? Cristiano sat down next to her, his presence grounding as always. "You know it," he said. "I've had injuries that kept me out for months." She sighed. "Yeah, but you knew you'd come back. You're Cristiano Ronaldo." He chuckled. "And you're Isabela." She looked at him. "That doesn't mean anything." "It does if you decide it does." She didn't respond. He leaned forward. "The greatest battles aren't fought on the field or the stage. They're fought in here." He tapped his temple. She exhaled. "I don't know if I'm strong enough." Cristiano smirked. "You're already stronger than you think." She swallowed, staring at her injured foot. Was she? Could she really come back from this? Or would she let fear win again? A choice that would define everything. That night, as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, she made a decision. She couldn't train physically, but she could train mentally. She could study, analyze, visualize. She could refuse to let this setback define her. She wasn't going to wait for life to hand her another opportunity. She was going to take it, no matter what. A test of willpower. The next few days were torture, not because of the pain, but because of the waiting. The physio confirmed it wasn't a major injury, but it was enough to sideline her for at least a week. A week felt like an eternity. Every second she wasn't training felt like she was falling behind, like the dream was slipping through her fingers again. She sat in the empty studio one evening, staring at her reflection in the mirror. What if this was a sign? What if she wasn't meant for this? Cristiano sat down next to her, his presence grounding as always. "You know it," he said. "I've had injuries that kept me out for months." She sighed. "Yeah, but you knew you'd come back. You're Cristiano Ronaldo." He chuckled. "And you're Isabela." She looked at him. "That doesn't mean anything." "It does if you decide it does." She didn't respond. He leaned forward. "The greatest battles aren't fought on the field or the stage. They're fought in here." He tapped his temple. She exhaled. "I don't know if I'm strong enough." Cristiano smirked. "You're already stronger than you think." She swallowed, staring at her injured foot. Was she? Could she really come back from this? Or would she let fear win again? A choice that would define everything. That night, as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, she made a decision. She couldn't train physically, but she could train mentally. She could study, analyze, visualize. She could refuse to let this setback define her. She wasn't going to wait for life to hand her another opportunity. She was going to take it, no matter what. Every step, every turn, every movement told a story. Of loss, of struggle, of a girl who had once believed she was broken but refused to stay that way. Cristiano watched, arms still crossed, but his smirk told her everything she needed to know. Sophia didn't say a word as the music ended. She simply nodded. "That," she said finally, "was the dancer I was waiting for." Isabela exhaled, her body trembling, not from exhaustion, but from relief. She had done it. She had proven it. To them. To herself. She was back. The unexpected opportunity. 2 weeks later, the call came. Sophia had pulled some strings. A prestigious dance company in Spain was hosting an open showcase for emerging dancers. It wasn't just any showcase. It was one of the most exclusive in Europe, an event where talent scouts, choreographers, and directors came searching for the next rising star. And Isabela had been invited to perform. Her breath caught when she heard the words. This was it. A chance she never thought she'd have again. A door she believed had closed forever. But now, it was wide open. The final test. The night of the showcase arrived faster than she expected. She stood backstage, dressed in a flowing costume of deep sapphire blue, her hair swept into an elegant bun. The stage lights glowed beyond the curtain, illuminating the polished wooden floor. The crowd beyond it was full of strangers, People who had never heard her name, never known her struggle, and yet their eyes would be on her. Her stomach twisted. The nerves were unbearable. But then, a familiar voice cut through the noise. "You ready for this?" She turned. Cristiano stood at the edge of the curtain, dressed casually but still exuding his natural aura of confidence. She managed a small, nervous smile. "I don't know." He studied her for a moment before stepping closer. "Let me tell you something," he said, his tone quiet but firm. "Every great player, every great performer, feels this fear before the moment that defines them." She swallowed hard. He smirked. "You've already won the hardest battle. Now it's just time to dance." Something in her steadied. She took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and stepped onto the stage. The lights were blinding. The audience was silent, waiting. And then, the music began. She moved, and in that moment, nothing else mattered. She wasn't Isabela, the waitress. She wasn't the girl who had given up. She was a dancer, a fighter, someone who had fallen and risen again. Her body flowed like water, her emotions pouring into every motion, every turn, every leap. The audience didn't just watch. They felt her. By the time the final note played, and she came to a breathless stop, there was silence. Then applause. Loud, thunderous. She stood there, chest heaving, taking it all in. She had done it. She had truly done it. And as she turned toward the edge of the stage, Cristiano met her gaze. He nodded once. Proud. She smiled. For the first time in years, she wasn't just existing. She was living. And this was only the beginning.